So our final speaker of this morning is Bryan Averbuch, who is Assistant Professor of History at the City University of New York at the College of Staten Island. Professor Averbuch received his PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University in 2013. He's particularly interested in cross-cultural trade in Islamic and world history, and he's working on a book project which is about the spice trade. It's tentatively titled Couriers of the Horizons, Islamic Spice Traders in the Indo-Pacific. Today he will speak on frankincense and camphor in Canton, Islamic seafarers and Indo-Pacific trade from the 8th to the 11th century. Please join me in welcoming Professor Averbuch.
Thank you to everyone first for being here today, and thank you very much indeed to the conference organizers for all their hard work in arranging this. All right, so this morning I'm going to be discussing the historical context of the Belitung ship from the point of view of the merchant seafarers who manned such vessels and whose trading ventures lay at the easternmost horizons of Islamic commerce between the 9th and 11th centuries CE. Now, right at the beginning, I want to just explain that when I say Islamic, I'm using this as shorthand for Islamicate, a term from Marshall Hodgson, the great historian. So Islamicate really refers to not only Muslims, but anybody within the general cultural domains of Islamic lands at this time, because merchants could be Jewish, they could be Christian, they could be Zoroastrian, as well as Muslim, and from a whole variety of ethnicities. So I'll be focusing today, above all, on the cargoes which Middle Eastern merchants would have been landing at ports like Canton and Quanzhou to exchange for the kinds of precious goods which filled the holds of ships like the one found off Belitung Island. I've chosen to begin, however, not with an image of the ship's Chinese cargo, nor with an example of the Middle Eastern goods which she would have carried into 9th century Canton, but rather with a chain of volcanic islands in the modern Indonesian province of North Maluku, once known as the Moluccas. In the 10th century, these small islands were the world's only source of a prized spice, cloves. This morning, I'll argue that spices and aromatics of the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific Rim, or Indo-Pacific, and I'll come back to that term, such as cloves and camphor, played a pivotal role in early Islamic maritime trade. Elites in Tang and Song China, as well as their counterparts in Islamic lands, craved these kinds of tropical luxuries, although their exact origins were at times vague or unknown to their consumers. For crews of Arabo-Persian ships like the one found off Belitung Island, these substances, along with an array of goods from the Middle East, Africa, and India, gave them access to the luxuries of China. I will also argue that Chinese desires for some of these commodities, such as camphor and cloves, were prompting the incipient expansion of Islamic commerce into the tropical Pacific Rim east of Sumatra by the end of the 10th century, a development which would have profound consequences for subsequent Islamic and Indo-Pacific history. Now, adapting the terminology of biogeographers and conservation scientists, both in a recently published volume chapter and in my book, I locate the early Islamic spice trade in the Indo-Pacific. Let's just see if we can advance that slide. No? Okay. No? So, key to advance. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, there we go. So this concept of the Indo-Pacific encompasses the tropical Indian and Pacific Oceans, and it takes into account the ecological and hydrographical continuities between them. The Indo-Pacific is subdivided into maritime and terrestrial ecoregions, that is to say, relatively large areas of land or water that contain distinct communities of plants and animals. In addition to transcending the traditional received division between the Indian and Pacific Ocean basins, which of course is arbitrary to some extent, I argue that this framing is particularly useful when dealing with the history of spices, aromatics, and other natural luxuries, because it allows us to place them precisely by ecoregion within their larger Indo-Pacific context. So, between the mid-8th and early 11th centuries, the domains of Islam stretch from the Atlantic coasts of North Africa and Iberia to the steppes of Central Asia and the Indus River Valley. While divided internally by the late 10th century between a number of rival caliphates and regional powers, commerce was flourishing across the domains of Islam, whose wealthy elites coveted a wide variety of imported luxuries. To satisfy these demands, merchants from Islamic lands traveled as far afield as Ghana, Byzantium, and the Volga Basin. Among the most prominent of their far-flung trading frontiers was the vast expanse of the tropical Indo-Pacific, which linked the domains of Islam to the markets of East Africa, India, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and the ports of southern China. According to Cosmas Indicopleustes, a Byzantine writer, 6th century maritime traders from Persia and Roman Egypt mainly obtained Chinese wares, such as silk, as well as Indo-Pacific spices and aromatics, such as cloves, in Sri Lanka. As texts and finds such as the Belitung Shipwreck show, by the 8th and 9th centuries, Islamic merchants were venturing well beyond Sri Lanka, regularly sailing from ports such as Siraf in Iran, Sohar in Oman, and Aden in Yemen, as far as the ports of South China, above all to Canton. Along the way, they traded in the markets of Srivijaya, a polity which exercised paramountcy over parts of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula between the 7th and early 11th centuries. They also traded with Champa on the coast of modern-day south-central Vietnam. In the turbulent decades of the late Tang dynasty, they generally preferred to obtain Chinese wares in these Indo-Pacific emporia rather than risking their ships and lives in ports like Canton, where the rebel general Huang Chao had massacred foreign merchants in 878. Nonetheless, Arabic sources show that Islamic merchants continued venturing to China even during these troubled times, while Chinese sources show that they began to return in earnest after the 950s with the advent of the Song dynasty. As we see in the Asia Society Museum exhibition, among the most prized of the many luxuries which flowed across the Indo-Pacific into the markets and palaces of Islamic Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba were, of course, the manufactured wares of China. But what kinds of cargoes would merchant seafarers arriving in Canton from Islamic lands have offered in exchange for luxuries like these? Chinese and Islamic sources, combined with archaeological evidence from shipwrecks and ports, give us a relatively clear idea. Now, it would be impossible to give a comprehensive list here, so this is only partial, but they would have commonly traded Iranian, Iraqi, and Egyptian glassware and ceramics. So an example of period glassware from the Corning Museum from Islamic lands. This one from Egypt or possibly Syria. So in addition to this, a range of Middle Eastern and Indian textiles, as well as the famed rosewater of Firuzabad in southern Iran. To these, we should add commodities like dates, as well as frankincense, very importantly, native to the coastal fog deserts of Oman and Yemen. Now, not all of us get to sample frankincense every day, and I couldn't bring you 9th century glass or textiles, but I did bring you frankincense, so I'll pass it around. Now, ships from Islamic lands also sailed with consignments of ivory and rock crystal. Feel free to open it up and have a go. So, with consignments of ivory and rock crystal, they would have also sailed with these, shipped from the coasts of modern-day Tanzania and Kenya to Iranian and Omani ports, where they joined ships bound for the Indies and for Canton. As seen above, Okay, there we go. As seen above, Islamic merchant seafarers trading with China, such as the ones who likely outfitted the Belitung ship, were in a good position to obtain camphor, cloves, and other Indo-Pacific spices and aromatics in the markets of Srivijaya, in Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, since their ships passed through these latter en route to and on the way home from the South China ports. Islamic authors of the era, such as al-Mas'udi, portrayed Srivijaya, in fact, as the great turntable of the Islamic spice trade at this time. And al-Mas'udi tells us, in the empire of the Maharaja, king of the Isles, they export camphor, aloes wood, cloves, sandalwood, mace, nutmeg. The sailors of Siraf and Oman continually make the voyage to Kala, the Malay Peninsula, and Zabaj, Sumatra. Now, these substances had all gradually come into regular use in the Middle East and China by late antiquity, where they played a wide variety of roles in medicine, cooking, and perfumery, and as prestige gifts. The Quran itself valorized camphor in a passage which declares, in a description of paradise, "Verily, the righteous shall drink from a cup of wine that has been mixed with camphor, a fountain where the devotees of God do drink, making it flow in unstinted abundance." Now, our sources show that contemporaries were not necessarily prepared to wait for the next life to enjoy Indo-Pacific luxuries. A mid-10th century Baghdad cookbook, the Kitab at-Tabikh by Ibn Sayyar al-Waraq, gives us recipes for a sweet delicacy called lauzinaj, that is to say, lozenges, the origin of the word, in which al-Waraq tells us are to be flavored and scented with camphor in one recipe and in another with rose water and cloves. Now, he also gives us, in the same cookbook, a recipe for sanbusaj, which calls for a filling of mutton, onions, and herbs to be seasoned with black pepper, cloves, and a variety of other spices. And since it's lunchtime soon, I give you an image of sanbusaj, the distant ancestor, of course, of our samosas. Now, of course, the chili peppers that you see at the bottom would not have been in a 10th century samosa because this is a New World crop. They would have had things like cloves, though, in the mixture. Okay, so none of this would have been too surprising, I think, to Chinese elites of the age, for as Schaefer and Donkin have shown, they put these kinds of substances to rather similar uses. Like their counterparts in Islamic lands, Tang and Song elites used Indo-Pacific spices and aromatics in cooking, medicine, and perfume. A temple in Xi'an, for example, burnt incense containing half an ounce of camphor and something like 5 ounces of sandalwood, while a Tang meat dish might be cooked containing a sauce with cloves. Chinese elites believed that this latter spice could also prevent intoxication. They would put it in their mouths during wine drinking. And Chinese doctors used cloves to treat toothaches. A look at Arabic and Chinese sources from the 9th to 11th centuries make it clear, however, that none of these substances would have come cheaply. Hard information about prices is scarce for this period, but I think that what we have is quite instructive. The 9th century Islamic merchant Suleiman reported in 851 that a man, that is to say 1.79 pounds approximately of camphor, fetched 50 strings of cash, around 50 Abbasid gold dinars. We get an exchange rate in the same source, at Canton, at government prices, or 25 strings of cash in public markets. A similar quantity in Tunis in 1030 fetched 62 dinars, while the same weight of cloves might cost 4.5 dinars in Fustat or Old Cairo around the end of the century. Towards the beginning of the 11th century in China, on the other hand, a kati, chin, so 1.31 pounds, of unspecified high-quality aromatics might cost 4 cash strings. Now, to put these figures in contemporary perspective, an Iraqi family with modest means could probably subsist on about 2 dinars a month in this period, while a 10th century Baghdad judge and grammarian, so a member of a well-to-do class, lived on a monthly budget of 20 dinars. Likewise, a banquet in Tang, China, we're told could cost several thousand cash, while a talented painter in China might live for a year on 20 strings of cash. It is clear, therefore, that Indo-Pacific luxuries were expensive on both sides of the ocean. To acquire them, Islamic merchant seafarers arriving in Malay and Sumatran trading posts would have offered a variety of goods, including large quantities of glassware, and, as John Guy has shown, Middle Eastern ceramics, for goods like cloves and camphor. As Guy and also Kenneth Hall have demonstrated, especially for slightly later periods, textiles, and particularly Indian textiles, would have also almost certainly been crucial to obtaining Indo-Pacific spices and aromatics. The very high sale price of camphor in 9th century Canton suggests that Muslim merchants would have been able to realize substantial profits by selling it there, along with their cargoes of Middle Eastern frankincense, glassware, and rosewater. The wares which they acquired in return and which filled the hold of the Belitung ship could be traded in turn on the way home for more spices and aromatics, to be sold alongside Chinese ceramics in Islamic markets. Now, all of this may make the Indo-Pacific look like a veritable sea of opportunities, But our Islamic merchants faced an array of real practical problems in this trade. Part of what helped make these Indo-Pacific luxuries so expensive was their confinement to a small number of Indo-Pacific ecoregions, coming back to that term again. Let's take a closer look at the sources of camphor and cloves. Now, camphor, this is Arabic Persian kafur, Chinese, a term which literally translates to dragon's brain perfume. It's the resin of Dryobalanops aromatica, or sumatrensis, a tree found in lowland rainforest ecoregions of Sumatra, the Malay Peninsula, and Borneo, which can reach heights of 196 feet, or 60 meters. This map shows the ecoregions in which Dryobalanops aromatica thrived. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the coastal emporium of Fansur on the west coast of Sumatra, along with the markets of Srivijaya, were the prime sources of camphor for merchants from Islamic lands. In Fansur, they obtained it directly from tribal peoples who gathered it from the rainforests, whereas in Srivijaya, the polity acted as an intermediary between them and the forest gatherers. The rainforests of North Borneo were another significant source, but at the time of the Belitung shipwreck in the mid-9th century, this seems to have been still unknown to Islamic merchants, although, as we shall see, this was about to change. Here's a look at the kind of lowland rainforests, then, just to give you a visual idea in which camphor trees grow. And just to give you an idea of the size, here's a look at one such tree. There we go. Oh, no. There we go. Now, since we don't see this one every day either, I brought some camphor. I warn you, it's strong stuff. And although you saw it in a recipe earlier, I would not advise trying that because we know now, of course, that camphor is poisonous. The newly discovered text of Abu Imran as-Sirafi, it's a 10th century text, True Tales of the Seas and Their Wonders, which Jean-Charles Ducen has discussed, contains vivid description of camphor trees of this type and their harvesting. And he tells us, nobody cuts down the camphor trees except for the people of Fansur. They consist of tribes, and every tribe has territory, and they do not transgress into each other's lands. They ask for prior payment from the merchants for the camphor, and they go into the forest to search for and cut down the tree. Then they cut it down, carry it back, and sell it to them. These Indo-Pacific lowland rainforests are among the most biodiverse ecoregions on the planet. And as we saw before, because of the monsoons, the sailors and merchants were obliged to spend significant periods of time on these coasts. The stories which they brought back about these places captured the imaginations of Islamic geographers such as Ibn Khordadbi, who recorded reports like this. In the forests are naked men, whose language is a sort of unintelligible whistle, and they turn away from the society of other men. On their heads they have reddish down, and they climb trees with their hands without the help of their feet. Now this, of course, as Tibbets remarked, would have been a Sumatran orangutan or a gibbon. Now, turning to the other substance, cloves, which Islamic contemporaries enjoyed in their sambusaj or samosas, and which Chinese cooks served in sauces for meat dishes, these came from even further away. Cloves, or qaranful in Persian and Arabic, and Chinese dingxiang, are in fact dried flower buds. These buds were gathered from the tree Eugenia aromatica, which were concentrated on the fertile slopes of 5 tiny volcanic Indo-Pacific islands in the Halmahera rainforest ecoregion of North Maluku, not far from the shores of New Guinea, in fact. So just to give you a close-up there and to get an idea of the distance, we're talking nearly 3,000 miles from the tip of western Sumatra. So here's a view of those islands, just to give you an impression of what they looked like. And here is a view of something that no Islamic trader or Chinese official of the 9th or 10th century would have ever seen, a living clove tree. All right, well, it's not advancing, so we'll skip the clove tree for the moment. However, I did manage to bring you some cloves as well. Well, you're right. The frankincense, in fact, came from Oman, from a market there. Okay, so thus, as seen in this brief look at these commodities, Srivijaya was not the source of many of the things which Islamic merchants purchased there. It was an entrepot whose cloves, aromatic white sandalwood, and nutmeg all came from Indo-Pacific islands, which lay between 12 and 1,800 miles further to the east as the seagull flies. Closer, in fact, to New Guinea and Australia than to the Asian mainland. Obviously, this would have substantially increased prices for Islamic merchants trading in Srivijaya. Camphor, of course, lay closer at hand, but in this case, too, merchants headed to China had to pay duty and passage fees on their cargoes at Srivijaya. And we know of one case in which a merchant from Oman was killed when he refused to pay. Faced with these problems, and no doubt wanting to obtain spices at the lowest possible prices, Islamic merchant seafarers would have had every reason to want to extend their ventures further to the east. No later than the 10th century, just a few generations after the Belitung ship foundered, we have evidence from Islamic and Chinese sources that they began to do so. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Muslim geographers recorded a few reports and rumors of peoples and islands in the eastern archipelago. These accounts frequently contain elements of the wondrous or fantastical, but nevertheless, there was an awareness of a vast expanse of ocean beyond Sumatra, dotted with volcanic islands and inhabited by tribal peoples with, from the point of view of contemporary Islamic scholars, strange and outlandish appearances. Thus, al-Mas'udi tells us, these islands of the Maharaja, that is to say Srivijaya, adjoin a sea whose extent has not been comprehended and whose end is unknown. It touches the Sea of China, and dispersed among its islands there are many mountains and people with white faces and pierced ears, which are tanned like leather shields. They shear their hair in rows. Fire comes out of their mountains day and night, reaching to the heavens. Ibn Khordadbi and Ibn al-Faqih both recorded rumors that cloves and other spices came from islands somewhere beyond Sumatra. This was, of course, correct, although their information was vague, and as Tibbets remarked, they seemed to have underestimated the distances. They give an itinerary which would get you about to Java, and I think that's significant for reasons that I'll come back to. Throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, Islamic geographers and compilers of ajaib, or wonders literature, recorded reports and rumors concerning an island or group of mysterious islands called Wak Wak. Tibbets, Tarawa, and Freeman Grenville show that in Southeast Asia, the term seems to indicate, quote, some island a little off the usual path of Arab traders. Thus, stories of islands a little off the route, as well as a few legendary tales, become attached to Wak Wak. Now, over time, the name Wak Wak becomes something of a movable feast, as standing in for a variety of remote and wondrous lands. Tibbet shows that in Southeast Asia, it moved further and further east as geographical knowledge improved, until finally by the 16th century, an Ottoman navigator places it somewhere south of Timor. Abu Imran as-Sirafi's recently discovered 10th century text, True Tales of the Seas and Their Wonders, contains some fascinating new information on the subject. As Dussen notes in a recent article, Abu Imran as-Sirafi represents Wak Wak as an island opposite China. In one passage, Abu Imran recorded sailing directions to this mysterious place. And he says, one of the sailors who had been to those islands told me that whoever departs the Sea of Sanji, this being the Sea of China, and crosses a distance of 30 zam or thereabouts, will arrive in the Wak Wak Islands. Now, Agios notes that a zam was a watch of 3 hours at sea, corresponding to roughly 12 nautical miles. The experimental sailing of Jewel of Muscat, a reconstruction of our 9th century Belitung shipwreck, suggests that a two-masted Middle Eastern cargo vessel of the era would have covered about 4 to 10 knots an hour. Thus, conservatively, 30 zam or watches may have represented something like 120 to 330 nautical miles. Looking at Abu Imran's text in light of this, it seems very likely that the sailor was describing a route to the Philippines and North Borneo. Of course, this is not to say that we have found Wak Wak, but rather, just as Tibbets, Turawa, and Freeman Grenville suggested, the generic name was attached to the itinerary. This information, I think, becomes all the more interesting in light of information provided by early Song Dynasty sources. These indicate that in 977 CE, a trade mission from the ruler of Brunei and North Borneo, with which the imperial court had not had any prior contact, arrived in China. As Jeff Wade has shown, foreign envoys with Arabic Islamic names, variously claiming to represent Middle Eastern polities, the Cholas of South India, Srivijaya, and the Cham kingdoms on the coast of modern-day Vietnam, frequently occur in Chinese records from this period. Just as they had done with Parthian, Indian, and Sogdian traders in earlier times, Chinese officials, and possibly the foreigners themselves, standardized their Islamic names, giving them surnames, usually Bu from Abu, or Li, i.e. Ali, also written as Yali at times. The deputy head of the Brunei mission was a man called Bu Yali, or Abu Ali. Abu Ali had first arrived in Brunei, we're told, with his companions Geshin, probably Qasim, and their shipmaster, Pulu Xie, possibly Abu Yusuf. The three men helped guide a Bruneian trade mission to China, which presented the Song court with large quantities of camphor, a local product, as seen earlier, of Borneo ecoregions, as well as cloves and aromatic sandalwood. Now, 15 years later, in 992, the enigmatic Abu Ali, or someone with the same name, is recorded again, this time as an envoy in an embassy from Java. And you'll remember the estimates of those Islamic geographers to the, quote, Spice Islands seem to get you as far as Java. Okay, so he comes as an ambassador from Java, which included in its tribute large quantities of sandalwood, as well as cloves in its tributes to the song. And finally, in 1011 CE, trade missions from the southern Philippine polities of Butuan and San Malanguo, which may well have been today's Zamboanga, also made contact with China. This is first contact. So these southern Philippine missions included envoys as well, with apparently Arabic Islamic names, such as Li Yuxie or Ali Yusuf. The Butuan embassy offered a local product, gold, to the Song court, but also cloves, while the envoys from Zamboanga included, along with elephant tusks and unspecified aromatics, typically Middle Eastern goods, such as dates, almonds, rosewater, white sugar, and cloudy glass bottles amongst their gifts. Taken together, the Chinese and Islamic texts indicate that Muslim merchants and seafarers were likely beginning to play an active, if fledgling, role in trade networks east of Srivijaya by the end of the 10th century. Archaeological evidence, which is just emerging, some of it, supports this interpretation. Excavations at Sungai Limau Manis in Brunei since 2002 confirm the existence of an active port settlement in this period with finds of Chinese and Southeast Asian trade goods, while digs in Butuan since the 1980s reveal small quantities of Middle Eastern glassware and ceramics alongside more numerous Chinese wares. Now, these could, of course, have arrived in the islands via third parties, but the near-simultaneous appearance of Islamic merchant envoys representing these policies and the offering of Middle Eastern goods in the embassies strongly suggest that Islamic merchants as well as Middle Eastern goods were starting to appear in these settlements. Further evidence of Islamic involvement in Indo-Pacific trading networks east of Srivijaya has also recently emerged from beneath the sea. At some point in the late 10th century, a merchant ship of indigenous Southeast Asian construction sank off of Cirebon on the north coast of Java. Excavated between 2004 and 2005, the Cirebon shipwreck yielded Chinese ceramics, gold, gemstones, ivory, and Buddhist artifacts, as well as Iranian and possibly Egyptian glassware and Islamic religious paraphernalia. These latter included a mold for making amulets with the inscription Al-Mulk Lillah Al-Wahid Al-Qahar, that is, sovereignty belongs to God, the One, the Victor, as well as wooden prayer beads inscribed with, as Horst Liebner notes in his study of the shipwreck, the names of God and or pious phrases in Arabic, depending on how they are read. While the glassware might easily have traveled independently of Islamic traders, the presence of an amulet mold, as well as ordinary wooden prayer beads, suggests that a Muslim merchant may have been aboard the ship. The find of the amulet mold is particularly interesting, since the Arabic sources on Southeast Asia in this period contain virtually no mention at all of Islamic attempts at proselytization. They just don't talk about it. Their priority seems to be commerce. So, if not representative of organized missionary activity per se, could Muslim traders have at least been peddling amulets as objects of spiritual power? Now, I argue in my book that the textual and archaeological evidence points to an incipient arrival of Islam in central Indo-Pacific islands to the east of Srivijaya in the mid to late 10th century. This is what I think was happening. Muslim merchants were exploring opportunities in North Borneo, the South Philippines, and Java. In each case, they entered into joint ventures, so to speak, with indigenous polities, which could provide Indo-Pacific luxuries, which, as we've seen, commanded high prices on the markets of China. What we're seeing here likely represents, I would argue, a process of island hopping, so to speak. Just as their late antique predecessors had ventured beyond Sri Lanka in search of Eastern luxuries, 10th century Islamic spice traders were attempting to place themselves further down the line towards their products, in hopes of finding better prices or barter terms. For 10th century Muslim traders hoping to market Indo-Pacific luxuries in China, trade with Brunei and the southern Philippines afforded access to an important, quote, new source of camphor, as well as cloves from the Moluccas, and the abundant gold of the southern Philippines, none of which would have been subject to customs dues at Srivijaya, because they're passed there. So the southern route, on the other hand, gave them access to cloves, nutmeg, and sandalwood arriving in northeast Java, which was in competition with and sometimes at war with Srivijaya by the late 10th century. The forays of Islamic traders in the central Indo-Pacific in this period therefore represent exploratory ventures rather than fully articulated networks. These are beginnings. These probes foreshadowed and may have laid some of the initial groundwork for, although there are many other factors at work, the establishment of archipelago-wide Islamic trade networks by the 14th and 15th centuries, and for the emergence of fledgling Islamic communities in the central Indo-Pacific. In conclusion, when looking at the Belitung shipwreck and early trade between China and Islamic lands, I would argue that we should not only think of the exchange of Chinese wares like ceramics, nor of Middle Eastern cargoes such as glass and frankincense, as we've seen, but also in terms of luxuries of the tropical Indo-Pacific. In the 9th century, demand for camphor, cloves, and other fine spices and aromatics in both the Middle East and China was deeply involving Muslim merchants in the commerce of Sumatra, the Malay Peninsula, and Champa. By the late 10th century, it was drawing them beyond the horizons of the known world, as seen from Baghdad or from Kaifeng. These are very early days in our quest to understand the initial expansion of the Islamic spice trade into the seas and islands east of Srivijaya and its relationship with the China trade. Most of our material and even some of our textual evidence has only come to light in the last 2 decades. Nevertheless, what is emerging from both sea and jungle is reshaping our understanding of this period. As the recent discoveries of the Belitung and Cirebon ships strongly suggest, collaborations between historians and archaeologists in the form, for example, of terrestrial and underwater surveys may yet shed much new light on this easternmost venture of early Islamic commerce. Thank you.